It is more than 7 years now since I began the study of the Lankavatara Sutra quite seriously, but owing to various interruptions I have not been able to carry out my plan as speedily as I wished. My friends in different fields of life have been kind and generous in various ways, and I now send out to the perusal of the English reading public this humble work of mine. There are yet many difficult and obscure passages in the sutra, which I have been unable to unravel to my own satisfaction. All such imperfections are to be corrected by competent scholars. I shall be fully content if I have made the understanding of this significant Mahayana text easier than before, even though this may be only to a very slight degree. In China, Buddhist scholars profoundly learned and endowed with spiritual insights made 3 or 4 attempts extending over a period of about 250 years to give an intelligible rendering of the Lankavatara. It goes without saying that these have helped immensely the present translator. May his also prove a stepping board, however feeble, towards a fuller interpretation of the sutra. The present English translation is based on the Sanskrit edition of Bunyu Nanzhou's published by the Otani University Press in 1923. I am most grateful to Mr. Dwight Goddard of Thetford, Vermont, U.S.A., who again helped me by typing the entire manuscript of the present book. To assist me in this way was indeed part of the object of his 3rd visit to this side of the Pacific. Says Confucius, "Is it not delightful to have a friend come from afar?" The saying applies most appropriately to this case. It was fortunate for the writer that he could secure the support and help of the Kaimakwai, a corporation organized to help research work of scholars in various fields of culture. For without it his work might have dragged on yet for some time to come. There is so much to be accomplished before he has to appear at the court of Emidewo, to whom he could say, "Here is my work. Humble though it is, I have tried to do my part to the full extent of my power." The writer renders his grateful acknowledgement here to all the advisors of the Society who kindly voted for the speedy culmination of this literary task. A task which he tenderly wishes would do something towards a better appreciation by the West of the sources of Eastern life and culture. Whatever literary work the present author is able to put before the reader, he cannot pass on without mentioning in it the name of his good, unselfish, public-minded Buddhist friend, Yakaki Ataka, who is always willing to help him in every possible way. If not for him, the author could never have carried out his plans to the extent he has so far accomplished. Materially, no visible results can be expected of this kind of undertaking, and yet a scholar has his worldly needs to meet. Unless we create one of these fine days an ideal community in which every member of it can put forth all his or her natural endowments and moral energies in the direction best fitted to develop them, and in the way most useful to all other members generally and individually, many obstacles are sure to bar the passage of those who would attempt things of no commercial value. Until then, bodhisattvas of all kinds are sorely needed everywhere. And is this not the teaching of the Lankavatara Sutra, which in its English garb now lies before his friend as well as all other readers? Thanks are also due to the writer's wife who went over the whole manuscript to give it whatever literary improvement it possesses. To Mr. Hoki Iizumi who gave helpful suggestions in the reading of the original text, and to Professor Yenga Teramoto for his ungrudging cooperation along the line of Tibetan knowledge. Daisaist Saitaro SUZUKI. Kyoto, November, 1931. Introduction. For those who have already read my studies in the Lankavatara Sutra 1, no special words are needed here. But to those who are not yet quite familiar with the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, an expository introduction to the principal theses of the Lanka may be welcome. Without something of preliminary knowledge as to what the sutra proposes to teach, it will be difficult to comprehend the text intelligently. For thoughts of deep signification are presented in a most unsystematic manner. As I said in my studies, the Lanka is a memorandum kept by a Mahayana master, in which he put down perhaps all the teachings of importance accepted by the Mahayana followers of his day. He apparently did not try to give them any order. And it is possible that the later redactors were not very careful in keeping faithfully whatever order there was in the beginning, thus giving the text a still more disorderly appearance. The introduction that follows may also serve as one to Mahayana Buddhism generally. I. The classification of beings. From the Mahayana point of view, beings are divisible into two heads. Those that are enlightened and those that are ignorant. The former are called Buddhas, including also Bodhisattvas, Arhats, and Pratyekabuddhas, while the latter comprise all the rest of beings under the general designation of Bala or Balaprithajana. Bala meaning undeveloped, puerile, or ignorant, and Prithajana people different from the enlightened. That is, the multitudes, or people of ordinary type, whose minds are found engrossed in the pursuit of egotistic pleasures and unawakened to the meaning of life. This class is also known as Sarvasattva, all beings or sentient beings. The Buddha wants to help the ignorant, hence the Buddhist teaching and discipline. 1 published by George Routledge and Sons, London. 1930. pp. XXXII plus 464. The Buddha. All the Buddhist teachings unfold themselves around the conception of Buddhahood. When this is adequately grasped, Buddhist philosophy with all its complications and superadditions will become luminous. What is the Buddha? According to Mahamati, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, who is the interlocutor of the Buddha in the Lanka, the Buddha is endowed with transcendental knowledge and a great compassionate heart. With the former he realizes that this world of particulars has no reality, is devoid of an ego substance, and that in this sense it resembles Maya or a visionary flower in the air. As thus it is above the category of being and non-being, it is declared to be pure and absolute and free from conditions. But the Buddha's transcendental wisdom is not always abiding in this high altitude. Because being instigated by an irresistible power which innerly pushes him back into a region of birth and death, he comes down among us and lives with us, who are ignorant and lost in the darkness of the passions. Nirvana is not the ultimate abode of Buddhahood, nor is enlightenment. Love and compassion is what essentially constitutes the self-nature of the all-knowing one. The Buddha is love. The Buddha's love is not something ego-centered. It is a will force which desires and acts in the realm of twofold egolessness. It is above the dualism of being and non-being, it rises from a heart of non-discrimination, it manifests itself in the conduct of purposelessness. It is the Tathagata's great love of all beings, which never ceases until every one of them is happily led to the final asylum of nirvana. For he refuses as long as there is a single unsaved soul to enjoy the bliss of samadhi to which he is entitled by his long spiritual discipline. The Tathagata is indeed the one who, endowed with a heart of all-embracing love and compassion, regards all beings as if they were his only child. If he himself enters into nirvana, no work will be done in the world where discrimination goes on and multitudinousness prevails. For this reason, he refuses to leave this world of relativity. All his thoughts are directed towards the ignorant and suffering masses of beings, for whom he is willing to sacrifice his enjoyment of absolute reality and self-absorption. Skillful means. The essential nature of love is to devise, to create, to accommodate itself to varying changing circumstances, and to this the Buddha's love is no exception. He is ever devising for the enlightenment and emancipation of all sentient beings. This is technically known as the working of skillful means. Upaya is the outcome of prajna and karuna. When love worries itself over the destiny of the ignorant, wisdom, so to speak, weaves a net of skillful means whereby to catch them up from the depths of the ocean called birth and death. By Upaya thus the oneness of reality wherein the Buddha's enlightened mind abides transforms itself into the manifoldness of particular existences. There is a gem known as Mani which is perfectly transparent and colorless in itself, and just because of this characteristic it reflects in it varieties of colors. In the same way the Buddha is conceived by beings. In the same way his teaching is interpreted by them. That is, each one recognizes the Buddha and his teaching according to his disposition, understanding, prejudice, propensity, and circumstance. Again, the Buddha treats his fellow beings as an expert physician treats his patients suffering from various forms of illness. The ultimate aim is to cure them, but as ailments differ, medicines and treatments cannot be the same. For this reason it is said that the Buddha speaks one language of enlightenment, which reverberates in the ears of his hearers in all possible sounds. Upaya may thus be considered in a way due to the infinite differentiation of individual characters rather than to the deliberate contrivance of transcendental wisdom on the part of the Buddha. One Buddha with many names. All the Buddhas are of one essence. They are the same as far as their inner enlightenment, their dharmakaya, and their being furnished with the 32 major and the 80 minor marks of excellence are concerned. But when they wish to train beings according to their characters, they assume varieties of forms appearing differently to different beings, and thus there are many titles and appellations of the Buddha as to be beyond calculation. One noteworthy fact about this, the Buddha's assuming so many names, is that he is not only known in various personal names but also given a number of abstract titles such as no birth, emptiness, suchness, reality, nirvana, eternity, sameness, trueness, cessation, etc. The Buddha is thus personal as well as metaphysical. The Lungka here does not forget to add that though the Buddha is known by so many different names, he is thereby neither fattened nor emaciated, as he is like the moon in water, neither immersed nor emerging. This simile is generally regarded as best describing the relation of unity and multiplicity, of one absolute reality and this world of names and forms. Transformation bodies of the Buddha. While the Trikaya dogma is not yet fully developed in the Lungka, each member of the Trinity is traceable in such ideas as Dharmata Buddha, Vipaka Buddha, and Nirmana Buddha. The notion of the transformation body inevitably follows from the Buddha's desire to save the ignorant whose minds are not enlightened enough to see straightway into the essence of Buddhahood. As they are not clear-sighted, something is to be devised to lead them to the right path, and this something must be in accord with their mentalities. If not, they are sure to go astray farther and farther. If they are not capable of grasping Buddhata as it is, let them have something of it and gradually be developed. The theory of Upaya is also the theory of Manomayakaya, will body. As the incarnation of a great compassionate heart, the Buddha ought to be able to take any form he wishes when he sees the sufferings of sentient beings. The will body is a part of the Buddha's plan of world salvation. This is one of the reasons why Buddhism is often regarded as polytheistic and at the same time pantheistic. The Bodhisattva and his 10 vows. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha is not the only agent who is engaged in the work of enlightening or saving the world. While he is able to transform himself into as many forms as are required by sentient beings, he is also assisted by his followers or sons as they are called in the Mahayana Sutras. Bodhisattvas are thus the sons of the Buddha and apply themselves most arduously and most assiduously to the cause of Buddhism. In fact, the actual work of world salvation, we can say, is carried on by these spiritual soldiers under the leadership of the Buddha. The latter is sometimes felt to be too remote, too serene, too superhuman, and his sight is often lost in the midst of our worldly struggles. But the Bodhisattva is always with us, and ever ready to be our confidant, for he is felt by us to share the same passions, impulses, and aspirations which are such great disturbing, though ennobling too, forces of our human life. To state the truth, sentient beings are all bodhisattvas, however ignorant and ready to err they may be. They are all Janaputras, the sons of the victorious, and harbor in themselves every possibility of attaining enlightenment. The bodhisattvas who have gone up successively all the rungs of the Bhumi ladder, and who are thus capable of extending their help over us, are really our own brethren. Therefore, Mahamedi of the Lungka opens his questions generally with this: I and other bodhisattvas, etc. Mahamedi is our mouthpiece voicing our wants and aspirations. Thus is not the place to consider historically how the conception evolved in Buddhism, whose primitive object seems to have consisted in the realization of arhatship. But we can state this, that the essence of bodhisattvahood is an unequivocal affirmation of the social, altruistic nature of humankind. Whatever enlightenment one gains, it must be shared by one's fellow beings. This idea is classically expressed in the Mahayana by the so-called 10 vows of Samantabhadra. The Bodhisattva is a man of inexhaustible vows. Without these he is not himself. To save the world. To bring all his fellow beings up to the same level of thought and feeling where he himself is. And not to rest, not to enter into nirvana until this is accomplished, how infinitely long and how inexpressively arduous the task may be. This is the Bodhisattva. Vowing to save all beings, which is technically known as Purvapranidhana in Mahayana terminology, cannot even for a moment be separated from the life of the Bodhisattva. The Buddha, being surrounded by these noble-minded sons, cannot fail finally to release all beings from the bondage of karma and ignorance and thirst for life. With this in view, he is always inspiring the Bodhisattvas with his sovereign power and sustaining them in their efforts to bring enlightenment in the whole triple world. The ignorant. Life as it is lived by most of us is a painful business, for we have to endure much in various ways. Our desires are thwarted, our wishes are crushed, and the worst is that we do not know how to get out of this whirlpool of greed, anger, and infatuation. We are at the extreme end of existence opposed to that of the Buddha. How can we leap over the abyss and reach the other shore? The Mahayana diagnosis of the conditions in which all sentient beings are placed is that they are all nursed by desire as mother, who is accompanied by pleasure and anger, while ignorance is father. To be cured of the disease, therefore, they must put an end to the continuous activities of this dualistic poisoning. When this is done, there is a state called emancipation which is full of bliss. The Buddhist question is thus: how is emancipation possible? And here rises the Mahayana system of philosophy. The turning back. To this philosophy, a special paragraph is devoted below. I wish here to say a few words concerning the important psychological event known as paravritti in the Lanka and other Mahayana literature. Paravritti literally means turning up or turning back or change. Technically, it is a spiritual change or transformation which takes place in the mind, especially suddenly. And I have called it revulsion in my studies in the Lankavatara, which, it will be seen, somewhat corresponds to what is known as conversion among the psychological students of religion. It is significant that the Mahayana has been insistent to urge its followers to experience this psychological transformation in their practical life. A mere intellectual understanding of the truth is not enough in the life of a Buddhist. The truth must be directly grasped, personally experienced, intuitively penetrated into. For then it will be distilled into life and determine its course. This paravritti, according to the Lanka, takes place in the alaya-vijnana or all-conserving mind, which is assumed to exist behind our individual empirical consciousnesses. The alaya is a metaphysical entity, and no psychological analysis can reach it. What we ordinarily know as the alaya is its working through a relative mind. The Mahayana calls this phase of the alaya tainted or defiled and tells us to be cleansed of it in order to experience a paravritti for the attainment of ultimate reality. Paravritti in another sense, therefore, is purification. In Buddhism, terms of coloring are much used. And becoming pure, free from all pigment, means that the alaya is thoroughly washed off its dualistic accretion or outflow. That is, that the Tathagata has effected his work of purification in the mind of a sentient being, which has so far failed to perceive its own oneness and allness. Being pure is to remain in its own selfhood or self-nature. While paravritti is psychological, it still retains its intellectual flavor, as most Buddhist terms do. Self-discipline and the Buddha's power. As long as paravritti is an experience and not mere understanding, it is evident that self-discipline plays an important role in the Buddhist life. This is insisted upon in the Lanka, as is illustrated in the use of such phrases as "do not rely on others," "strive yourselves," etc. But at the same time we must not forget the fact that the Lanka also emphasizes the necessity of the Buddha's power being added to the Bodhisattvas in their upward course of spiritual development and in the accomplishment of their great task of world salvation. If they were not thus so constantly sustained by the miraculous power of the Buddha, they would speedily fall into the group of the philosophers and Sravakas, and they would never be able to attain supreme enlightenment and preach the doctrine of universal emancipation. Indeed, when the Buddha so wishes, even such inanimate objects as mountains, woods, palaces, etc., will resound with the voice of the Buddha. How much more the bodhisattvas who are his spiritual inheritors. The doctrine of Adhisthana gains all the more significance when we consider the development of Mahayana Buddhism into the doctrine of salvation by faith alone. The power of a bodhisattva's original vows may also be judged as being derived from the Buddha. If the possibility of enlightenment is due to the Adhisthana or Prabhav of the Buddha, all the wonders that are to take place by the strength of the enlightenment must be inferred ultimately to issue from the fountainhead of Buddhahood itself. At any rate, the Mahayana idea of the Buddha being able to impart his power to others marks one of those epoch-making deviations which set off the Mahayana from so-called primitive or original Buddhism. When the Buddha comes to be considered capable of Adhisthana, the next step his devotees are logically led to take would be the idea of vicarious suffering or atonement. Giving power to another is a positive idea, while suffering for another may be said to be a negative one. Though this latter is strangely absent in the Lanka, the Gandhavayaha as well as the Prajnaparamita are quite eloquent in elucidating the doctrine of vicarious suffering. According to this doctrine, whatever suffering one is enduring may be transferred onto another if the latter sincerely desires, out of his unselfish and all-embracing love for others, to take these sufferings upon himself. So,
which set off the Mahayana from so-called primitive or original Buddhism. When the Buddha comes to be considered capable of Adhisthana, the next step his devotees are logically led to take would be the idea of vicarious suffering or atonement. Giving power to another is a positive idea, while suffering for another may be said to be a negative one. Though this latter is strangely absent in the Lanka, the Gandhavayaha as well as the Prajnaparamita are quite eloquent in elucidating the doctrine of vicarious suffering. According to this doctrine, whatever suffering one is enduring may be transferred on to another if the latter sincerely desires.